Hello, my name's Kasarik, and I just briefly want to talk to you about a insight that I had a while ago relating to the nature of God. Basically, the insight was to do with the fact that we can't prove that God does not exist. Now, the important thing there is that I can't prove that God doesn't exist. You can't prove that God doesn't exist. In fact, nobody can prove that God doesn't exist. Now, this also means that God cannot prove that God does not exist. And to me, that was actually quite an important insight, because God doesn't know if there isn't another God that sits above him in exactly the same way that he sits above us in terms of being our God, or the God. So basically, that has huge implications in terms of what God can actually do. Now, most people that I've spoken to this about have said, oh, but hang on, it doesn't work because God is not bound by the same constraints that we're bound by. God is in fact omniscient. The only problem with that is that the question then becomes, how does God know that God is omniscient? And while omniscience is something that we say we define God as being, and omniscience is effectively, in the way that I'm using it here, that God can know anything that is logically possible to know. The problem is that God can't know if there is something that he doesn't know. And by that I mean that, say for example, Ralph the Invisible Pink Unicorn, let's say Ralph the Invisible Pink Unicorn being invisible and not being able to see, and God has no way of detecting Ralph the Invisible Unicorn. So unless the unicorn reveals himself to God, then God will never know of the unicorn's existence. So basically, a being can never know if there are some things that it can't detect or isn't aware of. And effectively this means that no being can ever know whether it is omniscient or not. It may in fact be the case that a particular being is omniscient, as in knows everything that's logically possible to know. However, that being can never actually know whether it is in fact. In other words, it's not logically possible to know whether you're omniscient, and I'm sure there's a proof that can be derived for that. Now, the interesting thing, the really thing, mind-blowing, knock your socks off, front page headline news kind of thing about this, is that that realization means that the divine command theory immediately collapses. The divine command theory basically is saying that something is morally good if God commands it. But if God doesn't know that God is actually God, then God has no moral authority to make any kind of command on the basis that he is God. In other words, God has to rely on the same sort of moral reasoning as you rely on and that I rely on in order to come up with his commands. And essentially what this means is that all of the sort of commands that we see in, particularly in the major, three major monotheistic religions, and in other religions that rely heavily on the divine commands, those have no meaning. Those have no bearing, particularly where they're self-referring. For example, the first several commands that we find in the Ten Commandments, which all relate to the worship of God. Similarly, the entire concept of worshipping a God falls apart, because you can, would you worship a demigod? Would you worship something that isn't really God? Well, no. And so if God doesn't know that God is God, then God has no right to command that we worship him in any way, shape or form. So effectively, God is a supersentient. God is infinite, and I'm sure that that gives God extra wisdom. But God does not know that God is God, and that has huge implications for a whole range of things. Apart from the collapse of the divine command theory, this realisation also has quite significant implications for the nature of God. And the reason for that is that theologists and God, apparently, have been telling us for millennia that God is God. There is no other God. God is the supreme creator. God has a whole range of variables. But if God doesn't know that God is God, then a lot of these things fall apart as well. How can God be omnipotent? How can God know that he's omnipotent if he doesn't know that there's another God up there, running the show? The honesty question is a big one, though. We've been lied to, basically. I have yet to see any religion that comes and says, oh, look, here's God, but he doesn't actually know if he's God or not. He might be, but he doesn't know that he's God. And, until we get that kind of honesty, we've got to really doubt the whole concept, I suppose, of whether God is good as such. So, these ideas are ones that I'd certainly like to publish. The only problem that I have is that they come from my own little head, and I have no idea about the nature of the writings that may have preceded me. I'm a mystic, which means that while I've read a lot of philosophy and studied philosophy, I'm not a philosopher per se. So I would like assistance with that. Basically we'll see what happens, but hopefully everyone looking at this video will agree that it's worthy of being taken further and worthy of additional exploration. Thank you for your time. Enjoy.